My name's Jonathan Norman from the Major Projects Knowledge Hub, and I'm delighted to be interviewing Jonathan Whelan. I'm reading off the back of his wonderful book, Visualising Business Transformation, and Jonathan is an established business transformation specialist with over 30 years experience in roles including strategist, architect and program manager, and he's received wide acclaim from organisations globally for his insights. He's also a business architecture, a practical guide, and this new book, Visualising Business Transformation, which is tremendous. So, Jonathan, thank you. There are all sorts of analogies that people wheel out to explain the process of business transformation. A number of them are so cliched that they really don't have any value anymore. The transformation is a journey. We're on a journey. We try to find metaphors, and we sometimes use physical pictures and illustrations when we're talking about transformation. We don't tend to do that with other forms of project and program. So what is it about transformation that leads to this?
Firstly, thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction and for I guess giving me the opportunity to come and talk about the book. I am very proud of it. I'm very grateful for Steve's collaboration as well, because I think I've certainly learned from it, and I think Steve's learned from it, and yeah, and hopefully the idea is that we'll all get better insights into how to go about visualizing business transformation. And so to your question, yes, I sometimes feel that we're drowning in a metaphor sea. But why do we have the metaphor? Well, I think one of the biggest problems with transformation programs is getting everybody on the same page. Often the transformation program is triggered by some drivers, business drivers at the senior and executive management level, and often consultancies are brought in and help to shape that transformation, what a future state may look like. But that's all very well, but there's a big gap between that level of description of change and the people on in operations and customer facing, who on a day-to-day basis perhaps see something a little different to what the senior and executive management see. Because obviously the higher they get in the organisation, the further away they're getting from those operational areas. So how do you get everybody on the same page? And often, particularly on large-scale transformations, there's a lot of people involved, each with their own view of what the current problems are and opportunities are, and they have their own frustrations, and they see things differently. They're not seeing things in the wrong way; they're just seeing them the way they see them from their own experiences. So what's important is to try and get everybody recognizing that there is something that they're all aiming for, or some rationale for change. And not just what that thing is, but also what that means to them, and what the future may look like. It may be quite intangible, and it may not be known at the outset as well. So, and that's where the whole journey metaphor comes in. You don't necessarily know what the destination is, but hey, let's all get on the journey together and have an understanding of why we're on that journey, whether it's because we want to improve customer performance or reduce costs or whatever. So the analogy comes in quite well from that perspective. The other aspect of the journey metaphor is that large-scale transformations tend to be very linear based, a set of linear activities, almost waterfall in approach, and of course that fits in well with the journey. In contrast, if you were to look at agile developments, there's a much smaller scale, and the teams tend to be closer to the end game, to the customer. So their understanding of what's needed is much better understood amongst them. So you don't need so much of the metaphor.
Yes.
From a visual perspective, people see things, or rather their perception of the world is very much visual, and I think we spend about half our time processing visual information. That's what our brains spend that time, and so having something visual like a journey or something, you see the metaphor of the ground crumbling underneath people, so they can visualize that. So we need to do something to stabilize that. So what is it we need to do? So that's the idea, I think, behind the metaphor. So it does have some value. But I think it is a scale thing as well. The more people there are, I think, the more it tends to get used.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we talked about the journey, and there are obvious metaphors and ways of representing that in terms of maps or landscapes and using rich pictures. But if you look at all of the different visualizing techniques that you describe, there's at the one end you've got the kind of process diagrams and obviously even project plans and lollipop diagrams and as I say, rich pictures. What are the sort of parameters that go into creating a meaningful visual model for a transformation?
That's a very good question, and that's one that Steve and I had to try and answer in the early days of our collaboration. And our starting point was to say, well, what classifications are there out there at the moment? And there's generally two, maybe three classifications that are fairly well trodden. The BA block, the business analysis body of knowledge, for example, categorizes models and visualizations according to the subject. So, for example, the rationale, what's the motivation for a change, the drivers, the objectives and goals and such like. Models around people and the roles that they're performing, and then that takes you into activity models. Capability models, which obviously have been popular in recent years, and the data or information models, a bit more specialist, but nevertheless still important models. So that's the business analysis body of knowledge. Talk about it by subject or classified by subject. Systems engineering body of knowledge, for example, they categorize them as being according to their form. So they may, whether they're formal or informal or abstract, physical, and domain specific. So they've got that categorization. We've also seen categorizations according to how they're used. So, for example, if they're for stakeholder engagement or just general exploratory models, and reference models as well are quite common. But for us, it was more about the visual aspect, and so that led us to look at two aspects. The first one was the language itself that's being used and the constraints that are put on that language. And there are two extremes. You can go to the free form, so into photographs, pictures, freeform sketches, right through to the other end, which is highly constrained modeling language and notation, such as UML, the Unified Modeling Language. And the Unified Modeling Language has a specification which is about 800 pages, and is quite a tome to get to grips with, both in terms of modeling and also in terms of people, the recipients of those models. So that was one dimension for us, was the constraint of the language. And then we also looked at the what we call the concreteness of the language, which is how close is it to reality and to our experiences. And again, there are two extremes. One is it's very concrete. We relate to it. So a picture of a car, we can relate that to being a car. Through to something which is very, very abstract. And if I went back to the UML example, something there would be if I've got a box with a word in it, car, I don't relate to that in terms of my day-to-day experiences. So you have those two extremes. And so what we did was we did start to look at those individually. But then we thought we put the two together and to form a two-dimensional view, and that really gave us some great insights. I think I'm not sure if you've got a picture available that you can show.
Yeah, I will. I'll put that up. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So that's putting those two together. We came up with what we refer to as the visualization continuum. And what was interesting then was we could see that there was a clear pull towards the diagonal axis from the bottom left and the top right of that visualization itself. So not very much. So no free-form abstract visualizations and no constrained concrete visualizations. Everything would tend to be drawn to that diagonal continuum. And that's interesting because the more concrete a representation is, the less constraint that's needed for it, and that sort of works.
Mm.
And the other aspect that we realised was that you could also superimpose, and it's shown on the diagram, which I do hope you have. You can superimpose onto the continuum two communities of people. Community and change people, and these are people whose focus is very much on trying to create an understanding and a motivation for change. Coming back to our earlier points about people not quite knowing what the transformation is about, and that's that community of people are trying to do that across a disparate group of stakeholders. And then the second community, sorry, I should say that first community sort of addresses the top left of the continuum. And then the second community, the technical implementation community, these are the people who are really trying to figure out in enough detail what the future state will look like in order to be able to actually bring it about. And so therefore their models tend to be much more constrained. So in a general program context, the people in change community work with free-form presentations, rich pictures and such like, the results of whiteboard sessions, whereas the technical implementation community tend to look at more standards-based models like UML, Archimate, and such like.
Yeah. So I mean, just it occurs to me just talking to you now. So in a sense, the change management people are really thinking about what does the future look like? What does the future world look like? And in some ways, perhaps the standards-based people, perhaps more in the realm of project and program management and business analysis and things like this, are thinking about how do we get there? We're not actually defining what this looks like, but we're defining the route, the process by which the organization goes from A to whatever B is.
Exactly. So they've got to take the, forgive me for saying it, the fluffy words, the things which all sound very grand, but actually turn it into something very real.
Yes, yes.
And that's no easy task.
Yes, yes.
But even still, that doesn't mean that they should each have their own models. The whole idea is, and the thing that brought the collaboration from Steve and I together, resulting in the book, is that we actually wanted those communities to get closer together to understand what each other, if you like, is visualising, what it is that they see, so that we can see that as a collective rather than as two individual communities.
Yeah, you have a really great analogy in the book, which is the one about the stone and the bird. I don't know if you want to kind of share that.
Yeah, so the idea is that if you, how much can you predict things? If I throw a stone, I'm able to broadly and based on the laws of physics have an idea about its trajectory and where it's going to land, and that's a very much a sort of a mechanistic approach. But in a much more free-form emergent approach, rather than it being a stone, imagine it being a bird. If I throw the bird, I've got no idea where it's going to go. It may well fly up into the nearest tree and to seek some solace, but who knows?
Let's talk a bit about the kind of models and the different models that you've got. So what are the common forms of model, and they obviously have relative strengths and weaknesses, and some people feel a greater affinity for one type of model than the other. But what are their relative strengths and weaknesses?
Okay, so again, and it would be nice if you, we have another picture in the book which shows some categorizations or groupings of the models mapped to the continuum. I'm not sure if you have that. It'd be nice if you're able to.
Yeah, I'll put that up.
So overlaying those onto the continuum shows 4 groupings, which, and these are sort of moving top left to bottom right along the continuum. So starting with pictures, and then I could talk about each of them briefly. Pictures, templates and ad hoc visuals, then diagrams, and then at the bottom right, standards-based visuals. So pictures, that's where the model's intended to either directly or indirectly, through metaphor, for example, reflect the appearance of the subject. Generally, they're not always pictures, but they're accompanied by text. There could be sketches, and they tend to be used in one of 2 ways. Typically, at the and I mentioned earlier, at the start of a change journey, to explore dialogue and to get business leaders considering strategic options, understand the the drivers for change, the existing problems, the desires, and also trying to capture the feeling, if you like, of the people in the organisation, not just the mechanistic side of it. So what they tend to be is more tools for dialogue rather than this is what the current state is and this is what the future state needs to be. So that's where one of their strengths, and the other is during a transformation journey itself, because we said that when you get to the sort of the technical implementation community, they still need to understand the rationale for the objectives of the transformation and what it means to them. So you need their buy-in. So it's a way of engaging with them and to bring them on that journey. So pictures very much at the start, but not exclusively at the start of the transformation. Templates and ad hoc visuals. This is an interesting one because they're. So an example would be, for example, a SWOT analysis or the SWOT grid, customer journey maps, SIPOC diagrams, supplier input, process, output, customer, and the sort of the very popular business model canvas. So these are visualizations that already exist, but they're quite useful because they can bring a lot of structure for example, in a workshop environment. Been in a number of and led a number of workshops. We just put up a business model canvas on a whiteboard, and just get people to stand up and talk about it, and fill it in, discuss, debate. So they're very, very good for that. That type of situation. And then we've got diagrams. Diagrams covers quite a broad range of visualizations. And they can be, the result of brainstorming meetings, through to concept maps used to scope change initiatives, the very popular mind maps, causal loop diagrams, exploring systems and systems behavior, and so on. And then the fourth one is the standards-based visuals. So these are visuals that are based upon a set of rules, standards, usually published standards. So I mentioned earlier the Unified Modeling Language, UML, Archimate, the Business Process Model and Notation. These things come with, or certainly some of them come with very hefty specifications. And the reason for that is because they are also often shared via machines. The machine understood, People can exchange models electronically, and in some cases, process models, for example, can be used as part of a process automation, to name just one example. So I think those 4 general categories work, and they certainly seem to quite naturally fit in with the continuum.
Excellent, good. So let's kind of jump to the end and imagine that I've created this amazing model that I'm now going to use to sort of communicate elements of the change or the process. How, what are the practical ways for communicating my model and for sharing my model and for engaging people, apart from just showing people and say, look at this? How do I get people on board using these kinds of models?
Well, I think you sort of touched upon it in the question there, Jonathan, because you said that you're going and engaging people and saying, well, hey, look at this. To me, that's starting a dialogue, and I think that's the key thing, that visualizations, they're not intended to replace words. Change is fundamentally about people talking to each other, and understanding each other's perspective, understanding what's going on, because ultimately, from a transformation perspective, we want that shared understanding so that people then know what it is they're aiming for. So I think I'm like you. I quite like to create a model early on, and I do that to try and make it clear in my own mind what I'm visualizing and what it means to me. And I do think that's important, certainly on a large scale project. Well, certainly I found that important. But the point is, it's not saying what I've done is right, but it just gives me something to talk about in a structured way to other people. So that at least they can see it from my perspective, but then I want to understand it from their perspective. And so what's really important is the dialogue. I think the diagrams are helpful, but it's not about, for me anyway, it's not about an explanation of this is how it is. It's here's how I see it. What's your view? Let's engage, and let's find the shared understanding in what it is we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed the book. And thanks for sharing.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you again for the opportunity, Jonathan. I appreciate it.